Detective Harding had seen his fair share of crime scenes, but as he stood outside the glittering high-rise where Victor Crane had died just hours ago, he couldn't shake the feeling that this one would stay with him. The building was a monument to excess. Its reflective glass panels soared high above the city, casting shadows on the streets below. Harding tilted his head slightly, his sharp gray eyes narrowing as they followed the lights of the penthouse far above. No one really lived in places like this, he thought. They were just cages for people with too much money and too little happiness. He flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his heel before stepping past the uniformed officers stationed at the entrance. "Detective Harding," one officer greeted him, his tone clipped. "The scene's been locked down. Forensics is already up there." Harding nodded curtly, his long coat trailing behind him as he entered the lobby. The building's interior was as polished as its exterior, gleaming marble floors, modern abstract sculptures, the faint scent of something floral lingering in the air. The concierge at the front desk looked like he hadn't blinked since the first responders arrived, his hands trembling as he clutched a clipboard. Harding made a mental note to speak with him later. People like that often knew more than they let on. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent save for the faint hum of classical music through the speakers. Harding hated elevators, too confined, too still. His mind filled the silence with questions. Why now? Why here? Victor Crane wasn't just another tech entrepreneur. He was the tech entrepreneur, a self-made billionaire whose face had graced countless magazine covers. People like Crane didn't just fall off balconies. There was always more to the story. When the elevator doors slid open, Harding stepped into a scene that could have been ripped from a high-budget crime drama. The penthouse was immaculate, every detail screaming wealth and perfection. Expensive furniture, modern art, state-of-the-art gadgets, it was a temple to Victor Crane's success. But near the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that framed the city skyline, success had met an abrupt end. Crane's body lay in a crumpled heap near the balcony, his limbs twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled beneath his head, staining the pristine marble floor. A forensic tech knelt nearby, snapping photos. "Looks like he fell," came a voice from Harding's left. He turned to see Officer Daniels approaching, his hands shoved into his pockets. Daniels was an older cop, the kind who'd spent too many years waiting for retirement. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Probably leaned too far over after one too many drinks. Harding's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. The pristine surfaces, the untouched furniture, the eerie sense of calm. "And you're ready to call it an accident?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. Daniels shrugged. "I'm just saying what it looks like." "It looks too clean," Harding muttered, moving toward the body. He crouched, his sharp eyes scanning Crane's lifeless form. Something was missing. He couldn't put his finger on it until his gaze landed on Crane's wrist. It was bare. Harding frowned. He'd seen photos of Crane before, on magazine covers and business profiles. The man was practically married to his custom-made watch, a gaudy thing encrusted with diamonds. Its absence gnawed at Harding. "Where's his watch?" he asked. Daniels blinked, caught off guard. Maybe he took it off?" Harding didn't reply. Instead, he straightened and moved toward the balcony. The glass railing sparkled under the overhead lights, but something about it felt off. He ran his hand along the edge, pausing when his fingers brushed against a faint scratch on the metal frame. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it didn't belong here. Not in a place this meticulously maintained. Nearby, half hidden behind a large potted plant, something else caught Harding's attention. He crouched again, using a pen to nudge the object into view. It was a black leather glove, clearly expensive and entirely out of place. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands. There was something about the glove, something that didn't sit right. "Bag this," he called to one of the forensic techs, handing over the glove. Daniels watched him with a furrowed brow. "You think it's connected?" "I think it doesn't belong here," Harding replied, his tone clipped. He turned back toward the center of the room, his mind already racing. Who else has access to this place? Daniels scratched his head. Building employees, maybe a few close contacts. We'll get a list. Do that, Harding said. His eyes lingered on the body one last time before he turned away. This wasn't an accident. He could feel it in his gut. The next morning, Harding sat at his desk, the list Daniels had provided spread out in front of him. It wasn't long, just a handful of names. Building staff, Crane's business partner Alan Royce, and an ex-girlfriend named Sarah Lang. Harding's pen hovered over Sarah's name. Exes always complicated things. He decided to start there. Sarah's apartment was every bit as polished as she was. When she opened the door, Harding was struck by her presence. She was sharp, poised, and beautiful in a way that felt calculated. Her dark hair was pulled back, her makeup flawless, and her tailored blouse didn't have so much as a wrinkle. "Detective Harding," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "Come in." The interior of her apartment was as curated as her appearance, but Harding wasn't here to admire the decor. Sarah sat across from him in the living room, her posture perfect, her expression calm but guarded. "Victor and I hadn't spoken in weeks," she said when Harding asked about their relationship. "Our breakup was messy, but I didn't hate him. I've moved on." Harding studied her, noting the way her fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass when she spoke. "You knew about the deal he closed recently?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Of course. Everyone in his circle knew. It was all over the news." Harding nodded, letting the silence stretch. "Where were you last night?" "At home," she replied smoothly. "Working. I'm a little boring these days." Harding didn't press her further, but he wasn't convinced. Something about her was too polished. Too controlled. He left the apartment with more questions than answers. Harding left Sarah's apartment with a gnawing sense of unease. Her calm demeanor, her carefully measured responses, it all felt rehearsed. People didn't move on from a messy breakup with someone like Victor Crane without leaving scars. Either she was hiding something, or she was just very, very good at wearing a mask. Harding lit a cigarette as he descended the apartment's stone steps, the cold air biting at his cheeks. He had no proof yet, nothing to tie her to the crime, but his gut told him he'd be seeing her again before this was over. Back at the precinct, Harding spread the rest of the case files across his desk. Crane's financial records were pristine on the surface, no debts, no suspicious payments. But one thing caught Harding's eye, a deposit of several $1 million from an unknown entity just 2 days before his death. The timing was too perfect. Harding jotted down the transaction number and flagged it for follow-up. Money always told a story, and this story was one he intended to read cover to cover. Before he could dig deeper, his phone buzzed. It was the forensics lab. The glove he'd found at the scene had come back with an intriguing detail. Traces of Victor Crane's hair had been found on the interior, but there was something else, a faint residue of perfume. Not just any perfume, though, it was a rare, high-end brand sold in only a handful of boutiques in the city. Harding's lips twitched into a faint smile. He had a lead. The high-end perfume store was located in one of the city's wealthiest districts. Harding felt out of place the moment he stepped inside. The air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive fragrances, and the store's spotless white interior made him feel like he was walking through a museum. The clerk, a young woman with perfect hair and a practiced smile, greeted him warmly. She seemed surprised when Harding flashed his badge. "Perfume," she repeated, her brow furrowing slightly as Harding described the scent. "Oh, yes, I remember selling that one recently. It's not a common choice, very specific clientele." "Do you remember who bought it?" Harding asked, his tone calm but insistent. The clerk hesitated, glancing at the store's computer. "I don't have her name, but I do remember something about her. She had a tattoo on her wrist, a small, unusual design. She tried to hide it, pulling her sleeve down, but I noticed it when she was paying. Harding's jaw tightened. Sarah had been wearing long sleeves when he'd met her, and his mind immediately went to her. Coincidence? He didn't think so. He thanked the clerk and left the store, his thoughts racing. He needed to speak to Sarah again, but not just yet. He wanted to gather more evidence before confronting her. For now, there were other leads to pursue. Harding spent the rest of the afternoon sifting through the security footage from Crane's building. Hours of footage flickered across his screen, showing the comings and goings of residents, staff, and visitors. His eyes narrowed when he spotted a hooded figure entering the building around the same time Sarah had claimed to be home. The figure's face was obscured, but their movements were deliberate. They didn't linger in the lobby or hesitate at the elevators. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where they were going. Harding watched as the figure entered the elevator and rode it to the penthouse floor. But they never came back down. Harding rewound the footage, watching it again and again, searching for anything he might have missed. The hooded figure's presence raised more questions than answers. If they hadn't exited through the front door, how had they left the building? Was it possible they were still inside? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. It was Daniels, holding a folder. "Got something for you," he said, tossing it onto Harding's desk. "Access list for the building. Everyone who had a keycard to the penthouse." Harding flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names. Most of them were employees, housekeepers, maintenance workers. But two names stood out: Alan Royce, Crane's business partner, and Sarah Lang. Harding leaned back in his chair, his mind piecing together the connections. Royce had been suspiciously quiet since Crane's death. Harding decided it was time to pay him a visit. Alan Royce's home was as lavish as Crane's, though it lacked the sleek, modern aesthetic. Instead, Royce's mansion was all dark wood and old money, the kind of place that felt more like a museum than a home. Harding was greeted at the door by a butler who looked like he'd been hired to intimidate visitors. The man led Harding into a study where Royce was waiting, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Detective Harding," Royce said, his voice smooth and confident. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Harding didn't bother with pleasantries. "Victor Crane. I need to know about your relationship." Royce chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Victor and I were business partners. We built an empire together. His death is a tragedy, of course, but I fail to see how I can help you." Harding's sharp eyes never left Royce's face. Partners don't always see eye to eye, especially when money's involved. And I happen to know there was a lot of money moving around just before Victor's death. Royce's smile faltered, just for a moment. It was enough for Harding to know he'd struck a nerve. "I don't know what you're implying," Royce said, his tone colder now. "But I have nothing to hide." "Then you won't mind if I take a look around," Harding replied. Royce's jaw tightened, but before he could protest, Harding was already moving. The study was immaculate, but Harding's trained eye caught small details: a drawer slightly ajar, a file folder resting on the edge of Royce's desk. Inside the folder were financial records, and one transaction stood out immediately: a transfer of several $1,000,000 to a shell corporation. The same corporation that had deposited money into Crane's account. "You want to explain this?" Harding asked, holding up the file. Royce's face darkened. "That's private business." "Not anymore," Harding shot back. Before Royce could respond, Harding's phone buzzed. It was a call from the precinct. "I need to take this," Harding said, his eyes still locked on Royce. "Don't go anywhere." Stepping into the hallway, Harding answered the call. It was the lab again. They'd run further tests on the glove and found something new: fingerprints. And they didn't belong to Crane or Sarah. They belonged to someone else entirely: Officer Daniels. Harding's grip on the phone tightened as the lab tech confirmed what he'd just heard. "Daniels," he repeated, his voice low but sharp, his mind racing to make sense of it. "You're positive?" "Absolutely, Detective," the voice on the other end replied. "The fingerprints on the glove match his. We triple-checked. Harding ended the call without another word, his jaw clenching as he processed the revelation. Daniels, the officer who had been on the scene from the start, the man who had been so quick to dismiss the case as an accident, was now tied directly to the evidence. Harding's instincts had been screaming that something wasn't right with this case, and this was the confirmation he needed. But why? Why would Daniels, a beat cop nearing retirement, have anything to do with Victor Crane's death? Harding had always pegged him as lazy and indifferent, but this was something else entirely. He shoved the phone into his pocket and turned back toward the study, where Royce was waiting. But the room was empty. The glass of whiskey on the desk was still half full, condensation dripping down its sides. Harding's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. The door at the far end of the study, which he had assumed was a closet, was slightly ajar. "Royce!" Harding barked, striding toward the door. He yanked it open to reveal a narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. His pulse quickened as he followed it, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. When he reached the back door, it was already swinging shut. Royce was running. Harding burst through the door and into the sprawling backyard, his eyes quickly locking onto Royce's retreating figure. The man was surprisingly fast for someone who had spent his life in boardrooms, but Harding wasn't about to let him get away. He sprinted after him, the cold night air biting at his face as he closed the distance. "Stop!" Harding shouted, his voice cutting through the night. Royce didn't stop. He veered toward the edge of the property, where a high stone wall separated the estate from the alley beyond. Harding pushed himself harder, his coat billowing behind him as he lunged forward. Just as Royce reached the wall, Harding grabbed the back of his jacket and yanked him to the ground. Royce struggled, his hands clawing at the grass as Harding pinned him down. "You don't want to do this," Royce hissed, his voice trembling but defiant. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "What I'm getting into?" Harding shot back, his breath heavy. "What exactly am I getting into, Royce? Because I have a glove with your buddy Daniel's prints on it, I have a multi-million-dollar shell corporation tied to you, and I have a dead man who didn't fall off his balcony by accident. So why don't you fill me in?" Royce's eyes darted around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Finally, he sagged against the ground, his expression shifting from defiance to resignation. "Fine," he muttered. "You want the truth? Crane wasn't the saint everyone thinks he was. He was blackmailing me." Harding's brow furrowed, but he didn't loosen his grip. "Blackmailing you over what?" Royce hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Business deals. Offshore accounts. He found out about some creative accounting I'd done. Threatened to turn me in unless I paid him off. That's what the deposit was for, the last payment. I was trying to buy my way out. You expect me to believe that you just handed over the money and walked away?" Harding scoffed. "You didn't think about getting rid of him?" "I didn't kill him," Royce snapped, his voice rising. "I hated the bastard, but I didn't kill him. I swear." Harding studied Royce's face, his instincts telling him that the man was telling the truth, at least about not pulling the trigger himself. "Then who did?" Harding asked, his voice cold. "Because someone wanted Crane dead, and they went to a lot of trouble to make it happen." Royce hesitated again, his eyes shifting away from Harding. "I don't know," he said finally. "But Crane had other enemies. People who didn't just want money. People who wanted silence." Back at the precinct, Harding leaned back in his chair, replaying his conversation with Royce in his mind. The blackmail angle added another layer to the case, but it didn't explain everything. Someone had gone to great lengths to stage Crane's death as an accident, and Daniel's involvement was the missing piece. Harding needed answers, and he needed them now. "Where's Daniels?" Harding barked to a junior officer who was passing by his desk. The officer paused, looking startled. I think he's out on patrol." "Get him here," Harding ordered. "Now." The officer nodded and hurried off, leaving Harding alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the glove sitting in its evidence bag on his desk. Daniel's fingerprints were on the glove, but Harding needed more than that to connect him to the crime. He picked up the phone and called the lab again. "I need you to run another test on that glove," Harding said as soon as the lab tech answered. "Check for DNA. If Daniels wore it, there might be traces of sweat or skin cells inside." "Will do, Detective," the tech replied. "I'll prioritize it." Harding hung up and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they painted wasn't clear yet. He had Royce's confession about the blackmail, Sarah's connection to the perfume, and Daniel's fingerprints on the glove. But there was still the hooded figure in the security footage, the missing watch, and the scratched balcony railing. Too many loose ends. An hour later, Daniels walked into the precinct, his face as unreadable as ever. Harding stood and motioned for him to follow. "We need to talk," Harding said, leading Daniels into an interrogation room. Daniels sat down, his hands resting on the table. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual. Harding didn't sit. He stood across from Daniels, his arms crossed. "The glove we found at the scene," he began, his voice steady but sharp. "Your fingerprints are all over it." Daniels blinked, his expression not shifting. "What? That's impossible. I've never seen that glove before." "Don't lie to me," Harding snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "Your prints are on it. The lab confirmed it. So either you were at the scene before we arrived, or you've been covering for someone." Daniel's jaw tightened, his casual demeanor starting to crack. "You're wrong," he said, but his voice wavered. "I wasn't there." "Then explain the prints," Harding pressed, leaning in closer. "Explain why the man who was so quick to write this off as an accident is now at the center of the evidence." Daniels didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. Daniels shifted in his seat, his silence stretching long enough for Harding to feel the tension in the room thicken like smoke. The detective leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. "You're going to tell me what's going on, Daniels. Right now. Because your fingerprints on that glove are the beginning of the story. I want the rest." Daniels' eyes darted around the room, avoiding Harding's piercing gaze. His hands, which had been resting on the table, slowly clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the words held no conviction. Harding had seen this before, the hesitation, the panic bubbling just beneath the surface. Daniels was lying, and Harding was going to break him. "You don't know what I'm talking about?" Harding repeated, his voice sharp. He circled the table like a predator sizing up its prey. "You were the first officer on the scene. You dismissed this case as an accident before anyone had even looked at the evidence. And now your prints show up on a glove found at the scene. That's not a coincidence. So either you're involved, or you're covering for someone who is." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Harding thought he might lash out. But instead, the officer slumped back in his chair, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his secrets had finally become too much to bear. "You don't understand," Daniels said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have a choice." Harding stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Didn't have a choice," he repeated. "What does that mean?" Daniels rubbed his face with his hands, inhaling deeply before looking up at Harding. "Victor Crane was into some deep shit," he said, his voice shaking. "Stuff that could ruin people. He had dirt on everyone, politicians, businessmen, cops. Hell, he even had something on me." "What kind of dirt?" Harding asked, his voice steady but firm. Daniels hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door as if he were afraid someone might be listening. "A few years back, I made a mistake," he admitted. "I took some money under the table to look the other way on a case. I was desperate, my wife was sick, the medical bills were piling up. I thought no one would ever find out. But Crane did. He found out everything." Harding's stomach tightened as Daniel's confession spilled out. "So what did he want from you?" Harding pressed. Daniels clasped his hands together, his knuckles white. He wanted leverage. He said he'd keep my secret as long as I did what he asked. At first, it was small things, passing along information, keeping tabs on people. But then it got worse. He started asking me to look the other way on things. And when I tried to back out, he threatened to ruin me. Harding's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline. And the glove? How does that fit in? Daniels exhaled shakily. The glove isn't mine, he said. It belongs to someone else. Someone Crane was meeting that night. Who? Harding demanded, his voice rising. Daniels shook his head. I don't know. I swear. All I know is that Crane called me that night. He told me to come to the penthouse and clean up a mess. When I got there, he was already dead. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to make it look like an accident. I thought if I could just make it go away, no one would find out about my connection to him. Harding's blood boiled as he listened to Daniel's story. So you tampered with the scene, he said, his voice cold. You moved the body, wiped down surfaces, and left that glove behind in your rush to cover your tracks. Daniels nodded miserably. I wasn't thinking. I didn't want my life to fall apart. Harding stared at Daniels, his jaw clenched. You're a disgrace, he said finally. You let your fear and greed compromise everything this badge stands for. And now, because of you, we're no closer to finding out who really killed Victor Crane. Daniels didn't respond. His head hung low, his silence an admission of guilt. Harding left the interrogation room, his mind racing. Daniels' confession explained some of the inconsistencies in the case, but it raised even more questions. If Daniels didn't kill Crane, then who did? And who was the person Crane had been meeting that night, the person whose glove had been left behind? He returned to his desk and reviewed the evidence again, his eyes flicking from the glove to the security footage of the hooded figure entering the building. Something about the footage nagged at him. He rewound it, playing it back in slow motion, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure's movements. They were deliberate, confident. This wasn't someone who was lost or unsure. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going. Harding's phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was the forensic lab again. Detective Harding, the voice on the other end said, "We've got another development. We found trace DNA inside the glove. It's a match to Sarah Lang." Harding's grip on the phone tightened. Sarah. He had suspected she was involved, but this was the proof he needed. She had been at the penthouse that night, and she had lied to him about it. But the question remained, was she the killer, or was she just another pawn in this twisted game? Harding didn't waste any time. He drove straight to Sarah's apartment, his mind racing as he replayed their earlier conversation. She had been calm, composed, too perfect. The kind of person who had something to hide. When he arrived, he knocked on the door firmly, his jaw clenched as he waited. Sarah opened the door, her expression neutral but wary. "Detective," she said, her voice smooth. "This is unexpected." "We need to talk," Harding said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. She led him to the same pristine living room where they had spoken before, but this time Harding didn't bother with small talk. He turned to face her, his eyes cold. "You lied to me, Sarah." Her brow furrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Harding pulled the evidence bag containing the glove from his coat pocket and held it up. "This was found at the scene of Victor Crane's death," he said. "And your DNA is all over it." For the first time, Sarah's composure cracked. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came out. She stumbled back a step, her hands clutching the back of a chair for support. "I want the truth," Harding said, his voice low and dangerous. "What were you doing at the penthouse that night? And don't even think about lying to me again." Sarah's breathing quickened, and for a moment, Harding thought she might faint. But then she straightened, her eyes hardening as she met his gaze. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. I was there. But I didn't kill him. Sarah's words hung in the air, her voice trembling but resolute. Harding studied her carefully, his sharp gaze dissecting every twitch of her muscles, every flicker of her eyes. She looked cornered but not entirely broken. The kind of person who knew more than she was saying but was determined to control what spilled out. Harding leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. "You didn't kill him," he repeated. "Then why were you there, Sarah? And don't even try to dodge the question. Your DNA doesn't just end up inside a glove at a crime scene by accident." Sarah hesitated, her hand moving instinctively to her wrist, where her sleeve covered the tattoo the perfume clerk had mentioned earlier. Harding's eyes followed the movement, his suspicion growing. She caught the look and quickly let her hand drop, but the damage was done. "I can explain," she said finally, her voice cracking slightly. "Victor called me that night. He said he wanted to talk, that he had information about me. Things I couldn't let anyone else know." Harding's brow furrowed. "What kind of information?" Sarah's lips tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might shut down entirely. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to carry any longer. "He knew about my offshore accounts," she admitted. "Money I'd funneled out of some of his businesses while we were still together. He said he'd found out about it and wanted to renegotiate terms." She spat the last words bitterly, her mask of composure cracking further. "Blackmail," Harding said, his tone flat. "It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded. "He threatened to expose me unless I paid him. I didn't have a choice, I had to go. But when I got to the penthouse, he was already dead." Harding's eyes narrowed. "And the glove? How does that fit in?" Sarah looked down, her hands wringing together anxiously. "When I got there, the place was dark. I let myself in, but before I could even reach the main room, I saw someone. A man wearing a hood. He was standing near the balcony, looking down at Victor's body. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I hid behind some furniture. I must have dropped the glove then, I didn't even notice. The man left a few minutes later, and I ran. I didn't touch anything, I swear." Harding's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "You're saying there was someone else there, a hooded figure. Did you get a good look at him?" Sarah shook her head. "No. It was too dark, and I didn't dare move. But he wasn't tall, maybe average height. That's all I remember." Harding leaned back, his arms crossed. Sarah's story was plausible, but it didn't clear her entirely. She had motive, she was at the scene, and she'd lied to him before. But if she was telling the truth about the hooded figure, then someone else was involved, someone who could still be out there. "You should have come to me the moment this happened," Harding said, his voice hard. "Instead, you ran, you lied, and you tried to cover your tracks. That doesn't make you innocent." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "And what would you have done, detective? Arrested me? Thrown me to the wolves? People like Victor don't just have enemies, they have armies of people waiting to tear apart anyone who crosses them. I didn't kill him, but I knew that if I was linked to his death, it wouldn't matter. They'd come for me anyway." Harding's expression remained stony as he stood. "You're not off the hook, Sarah. Not by a long shot. If I find out you're hiding anything else, I'll personally make sure you go down for this." He turned and walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. "Stay available. I'll be back if I need more answers." Back at the precinct, Harding sat at his desk, the pieces of the case spread out before him like a fragmented jigsaw puzzle. Sarah's confession added another layer to the mystery, but it didn't solve it. What tied everything together? Daniel's tampering with the scene, Royce's blackmail payments, Sarah's offshore accounts, and now this hooded figure? He pulled up the security footage again, his eyes glued to the screen as he watched the hooded figure enter the building. This time, he focused on every detail, their gait, their posture, their movements. Something about the way they carried themselves felt familiar. Harding rewound the footage, playing it back at half speed. Then it hit him. The figure's stride was deliberate, measured, almost military. Harding had seen that kind of walk before, on Daniels. The realization chilled him. Was it possible that Daniels wasn't just covering for someone else, but was directly involved? Harding's instincts told him he was onto something, but he needed proof. He called the tech department. I need a cross-reference on Daniels' physical profile, height, weight, build, against the figure in the Crane Building security footage. See if there's a match. On it, Detective, the voice on the other end replied. While he waited, Harding reviewed the glove's DNA results again. Sarah's DNA was inside, but there was something else, a faint residue of blood. It didn't match Crane's. It was possible the glove had been used in another altercation before being left at the scene. The thought made Harding's stomach turn. How many layers did this case have? An hour later, the tech department called back. Detective Harding, we ran the comparison. The hooded figure matches Officer Daniels' physical profile with a 92% probability. Harding's grip on the phone tightened. Thank you, he said curtly before hanging up. It was all starting to make sense now. Daniels hadn't just tampered with the crime scene, he had been there before Crane's death. But why? And what was his connection to the hooded figure Sarah had seen? Harding didn't waste any time. He marched down the hallway to Daniels' office, his footsteps heavy with purpose. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Daniels was sitting at his desk, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as Harding entered, his eyes widening slightly. Detective, Daniels said, his voice trembling. What's going on? Harding didn't answer immediately. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his arms crossed. I know you were at the penthouse before Crane died, he said, his voice cold and firm. I've got security footage that matches your build, and I've got your prints on a glove left at the scene. You've been lying to me from the start, and it's time you came clean. Daniel's face turned ashen, and his hands fidgeted nervously on the desk. I can explain, he stammered. Harding stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Then start talking. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I was there, but I wasn't alone. Daniel's words hung in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. Harding's jaw tightened, his piercing gaze fixed on the broken officer in front of him. Not alone, he repeated, his voice low and menacing. Then who the hell was with you? Daniels rubbed his temples, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to speak. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear. Harding leaned over the desk, his voice sharp. Cut the sob story, Daniels. Start talking. Who was with you? Who killed Victor Crane? Daniels looked up, his eyes bloodshot and full of despair. It was Alan Royce, he finally said, the words tumbling out like a confession he'd been holding onto for too long. It was his idea. He wanted Crane dead. Harding's stomach churned, but he kept his face impassive. Royce, he asked, his voice icy. You expect me to believe that the man who hired you to clean up his mess was there in person? Daniels nodded frantically. Yes. He was there, but it wasn't supposed to go that far. Royce said he just wanted to scare Crane, to force him to back off from the blackmail and leave him alone. He told me to show up as backup, to help keep things under control. But when we got there, things escalated. Harding's lips pressed into a thin line as he processed Daniels' words. What do you mean escalated? Daniels dropped his head into his hands, his voice muffled. Crane wasn't scared. He laughed at Royce, called him pathetic, said he'd ruin him no matter what. Royce snapped. He shoved Crane toward the balcony. I tried to stop him, but it all happened so fast. Crane lost his balance. He fell. Harding's fists clenched at his sides. So you're telling me Crane's death was an accident? Daniels looked up, his face pale and desperate. Yes. I swear. Royce didn't mean to kill him. But after it happened, he panicked. He told me we needed to make it look like Crane had been alone, like he'd fallen on his own. That's when I moved the body, wiped down the railing, and left the place as clean as I could. But I must have dropped the glove. I didn't even realize until it was too late. Harding stared at Daniels, his mind racing. The story made sense, but there were still too many unanswered questions. If Royce was truly behind this, why had Sarah been there? And what about the hooded figure Sarah claimed to have seen? Something didn't add up. Why was Sarah Lang there? Harding demanded. You didn't mention her. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. Sarah? She wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't see her. If she showed up, it must have been after we left. Harding's gut twisted. He could feel the web of lies and half-truths tightening around him, but Daniels had given him enough to move forward. Where's Royce now? Harding asked, his voice cold. Daniels hesitated. I don't know. He said he needed to lay low for a while. I haven't heard from him since the night it happened. Harding straightened, his jaw set. You just made this worse for yourself, Daniels. You'll be lucky if you ever see the outside of a prison again. Daniels didn't respond. He looked utterly defeated, slumping in his chair like a man who had nothing left to lose. Harding left the interrogation room, his mind racing as he pieced together the story. If Daniels was telling the truth, then Royce had been directly involved in Crane's death. But something still didn't sit right. Daniels' account explained the tampering at the scene, but it didn't explain Sarah's role or the hooded figure in the security footage. Harding needed to find Royce, and he needed to find him fast. He returned to his desk and pulled up Royce's financial records again. Royce had claimed to be lying low, but Harding knew better. Men like Royce didn't just disappear, they left trails. Harding's eyes scanned the records until he found what he was looking for, a series of large cash withdrawals over the past week. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest Royce was planning to run. Harding picked up the phone and called the precinct's tech department. I need a location on Alan Royce, he said. Check any recent credit card transactions, property holdings, anything that could give us a lead. Got it, detective, the tech replied. I'll call you back as soon as I find something. While he waited, Harding reviewed the security footage one more time. The hooded figure's movements still nagged at him, but now that he knew Daniels was involved, he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure might be someone else entirely. He rewound the footage to the moment the figure entered the building, studying every detail. That's when he noticed something he had missed before. The figure was carrying something. A small object, tucked under their arm. Harding froze the frame and zoomed in. The resolution wasn't great, but the object looked like a briefcase. Suddenly, Harding's thoughts shifted. What if this wasn't just about blackmail? What if there was something else Crane had, something worth killing for? The tech department called back an hour later with a lead. Detective Harding, we've got a hit on Royce. He booked a private flight out of the city about an hour ago. The plane's scheduled to take off in 2 hours from a private airstrip on the outskirts of town. Harding didn't waste a second. He grabbed his coat and headed for his car, his pulse racing. If Royce was really trying to flee, this might be his only chance to catch him. The drive to the airstrip was tense, the city lights flashing by as Harding's mind raced through the possibilities. Royce had motive, opportunity, and now the means to escape. But something still didn't sit right. The briefcase, the hooded figure, Sarah's presence at the penthouse, there were still too many unanswered questions. When Harding arrived at the airstrip, he spotted Royce immediately. The man was standing near a sleek private jet, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. A small suitcase rested at his feet, and he was speaking to a flight attendant who looked nervous. Harding stepped out of his car, his hand resting on his holster as he approached. Alan Royce, he called out, his voice cutting through the night air. Royce turned, his face pale as he recognized Harding. Detective, he said, his voice calm but strained. What a surprise. Not as much of a surprise as finding out you were at the scene of Victor Crane's death, Harding shot back. You're not going anywhere. Royce's eyes flickered with panic, but he quickly composed himself. I don't know what you're talking about, he said smoothly. I had nothing to do with Victor's death. Save it, Harding snapped. Daniels already confessed. He told me everything. You wanted to scare Crane, but things got out of hand. And now you're trying to run. Royce's composure cracked, his expression twisting with anger. Daniels is a coward, he spat. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Harding took a step closer, his hand tightening on his holster. Then why are you running, Royce? What's in the briefcase? Royce's eyes darted to the briefcase at his feet, and for a moment, Harding thought he might grab it and make a break for it. But then Royce sighed, his shoulders slumping. You wouldn't understand, he muttered. Try me, Harding replied, his voice cold. Royce hesitated, then reached for the briefcase. Harding tensed, his hand ready to draw his weapon, but Royce didn't run. Instead, he opened the case and turned it toward Harding. Inside was a stack of documents, contracts, emails, photos. Evidence. This is what it's all about, Royce said, his voice bitter. Victor had dirt on everyone. Politicians, CEOs, cops. He was planning to release it all, to burn everything to the ground. I couldn't let that happen. Harding stared at the contents of the briefcase, his mind racing. This wasn't just about blackmail. This was bigger, much bigger. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Harding's eyes scanned the contents of the briefcase, his mind working overtime to process what he was seeing. Pages and pages of incriminating evidence, bank statements, internal memos, recorded phone call transcripts. It was a treasure trove of corruption implicating some of the city's most powerful figures. Politicians, corporate executives, law enforcement officials, names Harding recognized immediately. The kind of people who didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote them to suit their needs. This isn't just about you and Crane, is it? Harding said, his voice low but sharp. He looked up at Royce, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and resignation. This is about everyone he had leverage on. You didn't kill him because of blackmail. You killed him because he was going to take all of you down. Royce shook his head, his jaw tightening. I didn't kill him, he said, his voice trembling. I told you, it was an accident. But yes, Victor was a threat. He wasn't just blackmailing me, he was blackmailing half the city. He said he was tired of playing games, that he was going to expose everything. We couldn't let that happen. We? Harding repeated, narrowing his eyes. Who else is involved? Royce hesitated, his eyes darting toward the jet behind him. It doesn't matter, he said finally. You won't be able to stop them. They're too powerful. They'll bury you before you even get close. Harding took a step forward, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Try me. Royce's composure cracked, his fear spilling out in a torrent of words. It was the board, he blurted. The executives from Victor's companies. They were all in on it. They knew if Victor released what he had, their careers, their lives, everything would be over. They wanted him silenced. Harding felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected a conspiracy, but the scale of it was staggering. And Daniels, he asked. How does he fit in? Daniels was insurance, Royce admitted. They used him to keep things quiet, to clean up any messes. He was desperate enough to do whatever they asked. But he wasn't supposed to be there that night. He panicked, just like I did. Harding's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. The board members, Daniels, Sarah, the hooded figure, it was all connected. But there was still one unanswered question. The hooded figure, Harding said. Who is it? Royce's face paled, and he took a step back, shaking his head. I don't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear, I don't know. They didn't tell me everything. All I know is that someone else was working behind the scenes, someone who had their own agenda. Harding's patience was running out. He grabbed Royce by the collar, his voice rising. "You're lying." "Who was it?" Before Royce could answer, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Harding turned just in time to see a black SUV speeding toward them. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and two men in dark suits stepped out, guns drawn. Harding instinctively pulled his own weapon, shoving Royce behind him. "Detective Harding," one of the men said, his voice calm but menacing. "Step away from Mr. Royce. This is none of your concern." "Like hell it isn't," Harding shot back, his gun trained on the men. "You're here to clean up the mess, aren't you? Just like Daniels did for you." The men didn't respond. Instead, they advanced slowly, their weapons still raised. Harding's mind raced as he calculated his options. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't about to back down. "Royce," Harding said over his shoulder, his voice steady. "Get behind the car. Now." Royce hesitated, but the look in Harding's eyes left no room for argument. He scrambled toward Harding's car as the tension between the detective and the suited men reached its breaking point. "This is your last warning, detective," the man said, his voice cold. "Walk away." Harding smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. Not a chance. The standoff erupted into chaos. The men opened fire, their bullets sparking against the pavement as Harding dove for cover. He returned fire, his shots precise and deliberate. One of the men went down, clutching his leg, but the other pressed forward, his gun trained on Harding. Harding's mind was laser-focused as he moved, his years of experience kicking in. He ducked behind a nearby crate, reloading his weapon as the remaining man advanced. Royce cowered behind the car, shouting incoherently, but Harding blocked him out. He needed to end this. The suited man rounded the corner, his gun raised, but Harding was faster. He fired a single shot, hitting the man in the shoulder. The gun clattered to the ground as the man collapsed, groaning in pain. Harding didn't waste a second. He rushed forward, kicking the gun out of reach before turning back to Royce. "Get up," he barked. "We're leaving." Back at the precinct, Harding locked Royce in an interrogation room before collapsing into his chair. His body ached from the firefight, but his mind was sharper than ever. Royce's confession had blown the case wide open, but it had also made things infinitely more dangerous. If the board members were willing to send armed men to silence Royce, they wouldn't hesitate to come after Harding next. He glanced at the briefcase, which now sat on his desk. The evidence inside was enough to bring down the entire operation, but it was also a death sentence for anyone who handled it. Harding knew he couldn't do this alone. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Captain Briggs," he said when the line connected. "It's Harding. I need backup. And I need it now." Harding felt a strange calm settle over him as he hung up the phone. The storm was coming, but he wasn't going to face it alone. Captain Briggs was one of the few people Harding trusted implicitly, a straight shooter with decades of experience and no tolerance for corruption. If anyone could help him bring this conspiracy down, it was Briggs. The minutes ticked by as Harding reviewed the contents of the briefcase again, committing every detail to memory. The names, the transactions, the connections, it was all there, laid bare. But one name stood out above the rest, Alexander Pierce. A powerful CEO who sat at the helm of one of Victor Crane's most lucrative companies. If Royce's confession was to be believed, Pierce had been one of the key figures orchestrating the plot to silence Crane. And if the size of the payouts in the documents was any indication, Pierce wasn't just a participant, he was the ringleader. Harding's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy boots approaching. He looked up to see Captain Briggs entering the precinct, flanked by a handful of trusted officers. Briggs was a tall, imposing man with a gruff demeanor and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He nodded at Harding as he approached. "You've got my attention, Harding," Briggs said, his voice gravelly. "What the hell's going on?" Harding gestured toward the briefcase. "This," he said simply. It's all here, Captain. The blackmail, the corruption, the people pulling the strings. Victor Crane was sitting on a goldmine of dirt, and when he threatened to expose it, they killed him. Briggs frowned as he picked up one of the documents, his eyes scanning the page. Alexander Pierce, he muttered. I've heard his name come up before. Always suspected he was into shady business, but nothing ever stuck. You're telling me he's behind this? Harding nodded. Him and the rest of the board. Royce confessed that they were the ones who wanted Crane silenced. But there's more. Sarah Lang, Daniels, the hooded figure, they're all connected somehow. I'm close, Captain, but I need more time to put the pieces together. Briggs set the document down and looked Harding in the eye. You're playing with fire, Detective, he said. If even half of this is true, these people won't hesitate to come after you. Hell, they already sent a hit squad after Royce. You sure you're ready for what's coming? Harding's jaw tightened. I didn't sign up for this job to back down when things get messy. If we don't take them down, no one will. Briggs studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said. But we do this by the book. No shortcuts, no loose ends. We gather enough evidence to bury these bastards so deep they'll never see daylight again. The next step was to bring Sarah Lang back in for questioning. Harding wasn't convinced she'd told him the full truth, and now that he had Royce's confession and the documents, he had leverage. Briggs assigned 2 officers to retrieve her from her apartment, and within the hour, she was sitting in the interrogation room, her composure noticeably frayed. You again, Sarah said, her voice tinged with irritation as Harding entered the room. I thought we were done. Harding dropped the briefcase on the table with a loud thud, making Sarah flinch. We're far from done, he said, his tone cold. Royce spilled everything. I know about the blackmail, the offshore accounts, and the board's involvement. But there's still one thing I don't know, what your role in all of this really is. Sarah's eyes darted to the briefcase, her expression guarded. I already told you, she said. I was being blackmailed. I went to the penthouse that night to confront Victor, but he was already dead. Harding leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And yet, your DNA is on the glove found at the scene. You saw the hooded figure. You were there, Sarah, and I don't believe for a second that you were just an innocent bystander. Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the table. What do you want me to say? She snapped. That I killed him? That I pushed him off the balcony? I didn't. I had nothing to do with his death. Then tell me about the hooded figure, Harding said, his voice steady but firm. Who was it? Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Harding couldn't quite place, fear, guilt, or maybe both. I don't know who it was, she said finally. But I think Victor did. He mentioned someone he was afraid of. He called them the Fixer. Harding's brow furrowed. The Fixer? What does that mean? I don't know, Sarah said, shaking her head. But he said they were dangerous. That they handled problems for the board. If Victor was scared of them, then you should be, too. Harding leaned back, his mind racing. The hooded figure wasn't just some random thug, it was someone the board had hired to clean up their messes. Someone who was still out there, tying up loose ends. Later that night, Harding sat in the dimly lit precinct, poring over the documents once again. Every thread he pulled seemed to unravel a dozen more. The board, the Fixer, the missing pieces of the puzzle, it was all connected, but the final picture still eluded him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Briggs. We've tracked Pierce to his estate. SWAT's gearing up. Meet us there. Harding's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment everything came to a head. He grabbed his coat and the briefcase, his mind already focused on the confrontation ahead. Pierce's estate was a sprawling mansion surrounded by high walls and security cameras. The SWAT team moved in silently, their black uniforms blending into the night as they surrounded the property. Harding stood with Briggs at the command post, his heart pounding as he watched the operation unfold. "We've got a visual on Pierce," one of the officers reported through the radio. "He's in the study. Looks like he's shredding documents." "Not for long," Briggs muttered. He turned to Harding. "You ready?" Harding nodded, his jaw set. "Let's end this." The team moved in, breaching the front door with a deafening crash. Harding followed close behind, his gun drawn as they swept through the halls. The sound of footsteps and shouted commands echoed through the mansion as the officers secured each room. Finally, they reached the study. Pierce was standing behind a massive oak desk, his face pale but defiant as the SWAT officers trained their weapons on him. "Alexander Pierce," Harding said, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, blackmail, and the murder of Victor Crane." Pierce smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you've won, detective," he said. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into." Before Harding could respond, the lights in the mansion suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. A single gunshot rang out, followed by chaos. The room erupted into chaos as the single gunshot shattered the tense silence. Harding dropped to the floor instinctively, his weapon raised, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness was suffocating, broken only by the sporadic beams of flashlights wielded by the SWAT officers as they scrambled for cover. Somewhere in the confusion, Harding heard Pierce's voice shouting, but it was impossible to make out what he was saying. "Stay low." Briggs barked, his voice cutting through the din. "Find Pierce. Secure the area." Harding's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The sudden blackout wasn't a coincidence. This was a planned move, an escape route for Pierce, or worse, a trap. The Fixer. The thought struck Harding like a hammer. If the Fixer was here, then things were about to escalate to a whole new level of danger. "Pierce is on the move," one of the SWAT officers shouted. Harding turned toward the sound of the voice, his flashlight illuminating a side door that was swinging shut. Without thinking, he bolted after it, his adrenaline surging as he pushed through the door and into a narrow hallway. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Harding moved quickly but cautiously, his gun raised, his senses on high alert. He could hear footsteps ahead of him, two sets, one heavier than the other. Pierce wasn't alone. Harding's grip tightened on his weapon as he pressed forward. "Pierce!" Harding shouted into the darkness. "It's over. Stop running." No response. The footsteps continued, faster now, echoing down the corridor. Harding rounded a corner just in time to see a figure disappearing through another door at the end of the hall. He sprinted after them, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he kicked the door open and emerged into what appeared to be a large garage. The scene before him sent a jolt through his system. Pierce was there, standing by a sleek black SUV, his face pale and drenched in sweat. But he wasn't alone. Standing between Harding and Pierce was the hooded figure, the Fixer. Their face was obscured by the hood, but their stance was calm and deliberate, a pistol trained squarely on Harding. "Drop the gun," the Fixer commanded, their voice cold and mechanical, distorted by some kind of voice modulator. Harding raised his gun, his heart hammering in his chest. "Not happening," he said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "This ends here. Put down the weapon and step away from Pierce." The Fixer chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent a chill down Harding's spine. "You're out of your depth, detective," they said. "Walk away. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Harding shot back. "You're the one who cleans up their messes. You're the one who killed Victor Crane." The Fixer tilted their head slightly, as if considering his words. "Crane was a liability," they said finally. "He knew too much. He threatened the wrong people. His death was necessary." Harding's blood boiled at the casual way they spoke about taking a life. "And Daniels? Royce? How many others have you silenced for them?" The Fixer didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward, their guns still trained on Harding. "This is your last chance," they said. "Walk away. You don't have to die for this." Harding's jaw tightened. "Neither do you," he said. "Put the gun down. Let's end this without more bloodshed." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, without warning, the fixer moved. Their gun hand shifted toward Pierce, and Harding realized too late what they were doing. A single gunshot rang out, and Pierce crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. "No!" Harding shouted, firing his own weapon. The bullet struck the fixer in the shoulder, spinning them around and sending their gun clattering to the floor. Harding rushed forward, kicking the weapon out of reach before pinning the fixer against the SUV. "Who are you?" Harding demanded, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "Who are you working for?" The fixer didn't answer. Instead, they laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that only deepened Harding's frustration. "You think this is over?" they said, their voice still distorted. "You've barely scratched the surface." Harding's grip tightened. "Take off the hood," he ordered. "Now." The fixer hesitated, then slowly reached up and pulled back the hood. Harding's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the face beneath. It wasn't who he expected. It wasn't a hardened criminal or a shadowy assassin. It was Sarah Lang. "Sarah?" Harding whispered, his mind reeling. "You've got to be kidding me." Sarah smirked, her eyes cold and unrepentant. "Surprised, detective," she said, her voice now unmodulated but just as chilling. "You should have listened when I said you didn't understand." Harding stepped back, his gun still trained on her. "Why?" he demanded. "Why go through all of this? Why kill Crane?" Sarah's smirk faded, replaced by a look of pure contempt. "Crane was a fool," she said. "He thought he could play both sides, blackmail the board while keeping me in line. But I wasn't going to let him ruin everything I'd built. I've spent years cleaning up their messes, keeping their secrets, making sure the machine kept running. Crane was a threat to all of it." "And Pierce?" Harding asked, gesturing toward the lifeless body on the floor. "Was he a threat, too?" Sarah shrugged. "Pierce was weak. He was going to flip the moment you put pressure on him. He would have dragged me and the entire board down with him. I couldn't let that happen." Harding's hands shook with anger, but he forced himself to stay focused. "It's over, Sarah," he said. "You're under arrest. And this time, there's no fixer to save you." Sarah's eyes flashed with defiance, but she didn't resist as Harding pulled out his handcuffs and secured her wrists. The SWAT team arrived moments later, securing the scene and taking Sarah into custody. The aftermath was a blur of paperwork, interrogations, and media chaos. Sarah's arrest sent shockwaves through the city, exposing the corruption that had festered for years. The board members were rounded up one by one, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. Daniels, Royce, and even Sarah herself became key witnesses, their testimonies unraveling the web of deceit that had led to Victor Crane's death. In the end, justice was served, but at a cost. Harding knew the scars of this case would stay with him for a long time. But as he stood outside the precinct, watching the sunrise, he felt a sense of closure. Crane's killers had been brought to justice, and the city was a little less corrupt because of it. For now, that was enough.